Good afternoon. While we wait for others to come, just have a look at the fly sheet, please. You'll see that on the fly sheet there are lots of quotations. These are the quotations that I give in the course of the lecture, and that they encourage you to go to the text and see find the quotations for yourself, and then look at the surrounding text in order to see where they come. So you can follow the lecture by looking at the quotations, and the lecture gives the order in which I'm taking up themes. And at the end of the fly sheet, at the bottom of the second page, there's an important note on the particular quality that distinguishes Odysseus from all other heroes. The quality of what in our translation is called cunning intelligence or perfect planning. In ancient Greek, it's the quality of metis. So, for 3 years, Penelope tricked the suitors by saying she would marry one of them when she'd finished weaving a piece of cloth. By day she would weave, but by night she would undo the weaving until she was found out and forced to finish. Odysseus says to Athene at the end of book 13, when asking her advice about how to proceed, "Come, weave the design." The word for design is metis. Penelope says to the stranger beggar, who is really Odysseus in disguise, that to put off the suitors, I, quotes, weave my own wiles. Odysseus, when he is swimming in the sea for his life alone, wonders which of the immortals is weaving deception against me. The image of weaving is much used in the Odyssey. Homer's art is itself a bit like weaving a design. This is why I've called my lecture Weaving a Design, the irony of disguise. I want to look at how Homer plays on disguise and deception. At the back of this is a notion of the Odyssey as an epic drama performed live, not read, as we are doing, but sung over a number of days by a poet-singer who, to some extent, is free to make his own way through the story. The first point to note is that disguise is a form of namelessness, and that the whole epic concerns the naming and recognition of Odysseus as a hero. But there's a difference between how the theme of naming and recognition is treated in the first half of the epic and in the second half. Remember that we only meet Odysseus in book 5 on the island of Scheria, on the island, of Calypso, who has kept him hidden with her for 7 years. Book 5 ends with Odysseus struggling onto the Phaeacians' island after swimming for his life, exhausted, naked, alone, and nameless. There's nobody else to tell the Phaeacians who he is. He cannot tell them himself, because who would believe him? The world is full of wandering nobodies, claiming to be somebody special. Somehow, starting from nothing, He has to get himself into a position where he will be acknowledged as Odysseus by the Phaeacians, honored by them with gifts, and taken home. He does this by using the quality which sets him apart as a hero, the quality of cunning intelligence, or metis. During a feast, still as an unnamed singer, he asks, as an unnamed stranger, he asks the Phaeacian singer Demodocus to sing the story of how Odysseus tricked the Trojans with the wooden horse. His reaction to Demodocus' song prompts the Phaeacian king to ask the stranger who he is. This is at the end of Book 8. Odysseus identifies himself. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, known before all men for the study of crafty designs. And he starts telling the story of his great wanderings from the time he and his companions left Troy. It's an unusual story, full of semi-human, semi-godly beings, not the kind of story about heroes or gods that people were used to. Halfway through, he pauses, and Alcinous, the Phaeacian king, comments on its unusual form. We, as we look upon you, do not imagine that you are a deceptive or thievish man, he says, making up lying stories from which no one could learn anything. You have a grace upon your words, and there is sound sense within them, and expertly, as a singer would do, you have told the story of the dismal sorrows befallen yourself and all of the Greeks. But, he says, come now. Can you give us, tell me this, and give me an accurate answer. Did you see any of your godlike companions who once with you went to Troy and there met their destiny? In other words, can you tell us a more normal story of heroes who died on the field of battle? And Odysseus, his audience entranced, immediately tells how he met the spirits of Agamemnon and Achilles in Hades. Homer the poet is thus constructing a new kind of epic of homecoming and the restoration of order rather than of war. And he has his hero, Odysseus, tell his own story, sing his own fame. So we have three issues mixed together. One, a new kind of epic. Two, a correspondingly new kind of hero who uses storytelling to further his purpose. And three, namelessness, or the process of being recognized as somebody, not nobody. Of course, the first major story that he tells, the Phaeacians, is how he got out of the Cyclops cave by pretending to be called nobody, which is why the story is thematically so important. The second half of the epic plays on namelessness differently. Here, disguise is central. What appears to be a wandering beggar, a nobody, is really the hero, Odysseus, in disguise. Again, the hero is landed on an island, this time his own island of Ithaca, alone, without companions to say who he is. But this time he knows, because he's been down to Hades and has been told this by Tiresias, that he's alone against numerous young men, suitors, who have been pestering his wife Penelope to marry one of them. Somehow he has to manipulate himself into a position where he can control events and his own actual story. Again, he does this by using his special skill of cunning intelligence and by telling stories of what he knows about the real Odysseus. At one point, the swineherd Eumaeus says to Penelope, "Such stories he tells, he would charm out the dear heart within you, as when a man looks to a singer who has been given from the gods the skill with which he sings for delight of mortals, so he enchanted me in the halls as he sat beside me." And Homer himself says in Book 19, he knew how to say many false things that were like true sayings. Because the beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, claims to have news of the real Odysseus, he gains an interview with his wife Penelope. There is then a very poignant part of the story when appearance and reality are very close. When Odysseus in disguise is talking about the real Odysseus to Penelope, foretelling his imminent return, he persuades Penelope that he has a special relation with the real Odysseus, and is invited by her to attend the feast next day when the suitors will compete to string Odysseus' bow and win her for wife. The second half thus goes from Odysseus as nothing to his recognition as husband, father, hero, king, to the restoration of order in his palace, and to the revelation of truth, as opposed to all the lying stories, disguise, and deception he has had to use to gain his homecoming. The movement is from outer to inner identity and recognition. Odysseus moves from the outermost part of his estate to his palace, and then to the inner chambers of his wife Penelope. The final recognition of Odysseus by his wife involves her testing him about the marriage bed. I'll return to untangle some of these issues later, but for the moment, I want to emphasize that Odysseus' storytelling skill is part of his general ability to get the better of every situation, what in ancient Greek is called metis, translated in our edition as cunning intelligence, design, or perfect planning. A singer is close to the gods, for he's inspired by the muse and tells of events that ordinary mortals don't know of. Similarly, the quality of metis is godlike, in that it is able to pierce through the established order of things to secure an advantage. It threatens the order of gods and men. And it is for this reason that Odysseus is punished by Poseidon when he shows such incredible metis in getting out of the Cyclops' cave. Not just because Poseidon is Polyphemus' father. Homer the poet is thus putting his own skill as a singer into the picture of heroism in the Odyssey. This relation between singing and commanding events is made explicit by Homer at the key point when Odysseus in disguise, having been invited by Penelope to attend the bow contest, is given the bow after several suitors have tried to string it and failed. This is the climax up to which the second half has led, when Odysseus reveals himself and takes control. The suitors are, of course, dismissive of the beggar handling a bow. He must be a thief, quotes. So the suitors talked, but now resourceful Odysseus, once he'd taken up the great bow and looked it all over, as when a man who well understands the lyre and singing, easily, holding it on either side, pulls the strongly twisted cord of sheep's gut so as to slip it over a new peg, so without any strain, Odysseus strung the great bow. Then, plucking it in his right hand, he tested the bowstring, and it gave back an excellent sound, like the voice of a swallow. And Zeus, showing forth his portents, thundered mightily. Odysseus then throws off his rags and says, here is a task that has been achieved without deception. And he starts killing the suitors. I'll go back now over some of the central issues. Disguise is a central element in the second half of the Odyssey. Because Odysseus is alone when he gets back to Ithaca, he has to use the two qualities for which he's most famous. Cunning intelligence, or metis, the quality for which he made himself famous at Troy when he devised the trick of the wooden horse, and the quality that got him out of the Cyclops cave, and secondly, the power to endure humiliation and suffering. When he visited Hades in Book 11 during his great wanderings, he heard from the blind prophet Tiresias that suitors were pestering his wife, Penelope, to marry one of them, and eating up all the stock of his estate. But in fairness, he should assess the situation for himself. He's heard that Penelope has been faithful to him. But should he believe hearsay? He must test the truth for himself. His son, Telemachus, will have recently come into manhood, but of his qualities Odysseus has no experience. Can Telemachus be relied upon not to give the game away when his father is being humiliated in the palace by the suitors? Odysseus doesn't know. For these reasons, Athene advises him to go in disguise in order to make trial of each and everyone on his estate. Gods also go in disguise. It's one of the reasons that you have to treat all people well, for you never know who might be behind an appearance. When one of the suitors throws a footstool at Odysseus in disguise in Book 17, others are shocked and say, "You did badly to hit the unhappy vagabond. A curse on you if he turns out to be some god from heaven." For the gods do take on all sorts of transformations, appearing as strangers from elsewhere, and thus they range at large through the cities, watching to see which men keep the laws and which are violent. Behind the figure of a beggar, there may be a king and a hero. By going in disguise, Odysseus is able to make a trial of the appearances of things, testing the reality behind appearances. Disguised as a wandering beggar, he can go anywhere. As a vagabond, someone who's been wandering from place to place, he's expected to have news of other places. But as a beggar who has to sing for his supper, he's expected to exaggerate and lie, not to tell the truth. Here lies the dramatic irony of the epic. Appearances have to be tested. Odysseus must go in disguise even on his own land, in his own home. How do his servants, how do the suitors, how does his son, his father, his wife treat him when they don't know who he is? Do they treat wandering nobodies properly? Moreover, in disguise as a beggar who says he's wandered afar and heard news of Odysseus, he is the bearer of truth about his own homecoming, something on which the whole situation depends, for which everybody is waiting. But why should a hungry beggar be believed? Penelope has become so habituated to the unpleasant reality of Odysseus' absence that her mind takes refuge in dreams, a different kind of wandering. Finally, when Odysseus throws off his disguise and confronts the suitors, he is the bearer of truth in another sense, that of a higher moral reality behind appearances. For he will restore the order that was upset in his absence by the continued disorderly, violent presence of the suitors. These three aspects of truth, disguise, and wandering are interwoven in the epic. The Greek word for truth, aletheia, literally means not hidden, not disguised, not forgotten. A singer in ancient Greece has the special role of not letting famous men and events be forgotten. And in this sense, he not only makes a hero's name immortal, he creates truth. In sound, aletheia is very like the term for wandering, aletheia. Aletheia and aletheia. Homer makes use of the close sound of these two words, playing on where their meaning intersects. For instance, in Book 14, the swineherd Eumaeus says to Odysseus in disguise, who has come to his yard as a vagabond, "Old sir, there is none who could come here bringing a report of him," i.e. the true Odysseus, "and persuade his wife and his dear son. And yet there are vain and vagabond men in need of sustenance who tell lies and are unwilling to give a true story. And any vagrant who makes his way to the land of Ithaca goes to my mistress and babbles his lies to her. So you too, old sir, might spin out a well-made story if someone would give you a cloak or tunic to wear for it." Note here the play on spinning or weaving. Eumaeus, after hearing the vagabond's tale, says that nothing will convince him that Odysseus is still alive. The irony, of course, is that Odysseus is standing right in front of him. The truth is right there, though in disguise. The second half of the Odyssey thus plays on the theme of wandering in a different way from the first. The first half has the returning hero wandering over the sea, calling on all manner of half-gods, nymphs, and magical beings, as well as journeying to the underworld to meet the spirits of the dead. It's a voyage that tests his powers of endurance and his cunning intelligence. Poseidon, whose realm is the sea, has caused Odysseus a lot of trouble, though he hasn't been able to prevent his homecoming, for that is ordained by the gods. But the voyage home should also be seen in the light of what is expected of a man in times of peace, not war, who wants to build up a reputation and fame for himself and to have a successful homecoming instead of a tragic one. At the risk of going over ideas you may already have discussed, I want briefly to outline 6 background issues. So these are point 5 on the fly sheet, bottom of page 1. The first of these background issues is the nature of Odysseus' heroism. I've already said a bit about this. Odysseus has proved himself on the field of battle at Troy. The problem of the Odyssey is to demonstrate a set of qualities that enable a hero to have a successful homecoming against all odds, something emphasized in the first lines of the epic. A hero who dies on the field of battle makes a name for himself that will last forever. But what about a hero who survives? The first contrast here is with Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, who died at Troy, whose spirit Odysseus meets in Hades, and whose memory Odysseus recalls when he is swimming for his life in the sea after leaving Calypso, and Poseidon has sent a little storm to break up his boat. Will Odysseus die in the sea unknown? Far better to have died at Troy, like Achilles. Achilles himself doesn't agree. He'd far prefer to be alive than dead, even as a servant or landless labourer. The other contrast with heroism is with the returned leader of the Greek expedition, Agamemnon, whose wife, Clytemnestra, did not remain faithful while he was away, but ran off with another man, Aegisthus. Together they kill Agamemnon on his return. This is not a good example of a hero's homecoming. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, was still too young to do anything about the murder at the time, and he fled. But later, he killed both his mother and her new husband, and the whole story became a favorite topic in Greek tragedy. Agamemnon's homecoming was tragic. The contrast of Agamemnon with Odysseus, then, is not only hero with hero, but hero's wife with wife, son with son. Penelope is faithful, Clytemnestra is not. Orestes eventually punishes the wrongdoing of his mother and her lover. What is Telemachus' role to be? This brings us to the second background issue, that of Telemachus' age. It's essential to the plot of the Odyssey that Telemachus should just be coming into manhood at the time of Odysseus' return. It's this that makes the situation so electric, ready to boil over. At the very time that it does come to a head, when Penelope decides to set up the bow contest in order to see whom she will marry, there Odysseus is, ready and waiting, ready to reveal himself, the truth behind the disguise. The effect of Telemachus starting to take charge of his absent father's household is twofold. One on the suitors, the other on his mother. The suitors see Telemachus as a threat to their own position, not only because he might become their king, but because he's spoiling the good times they are having at his expense. And they plot to kill him. The hostility thus comes into the open, whereas previously, when Telemachus had been younger, they hadn't bothered about him. The effect of Telemachus' coming of age on his mother, Penelope, on the other hand, is to force her to take a decision about remarriage. As she tells one of the suitors in Book 18, when you see our son Odysseus, before he'd gone, said to her, when you see our son grown up and bearded, then you may marry whoever you want, forsaking your household. And to Odysseus himself, when he is in disguise as a beggar and she is quizzing him about the real Odysseus, Penelope says, now I cannot escape from this marriage. I can no longer think of another plan. My parents are urgent with me to marry. My son is vexed as they eat away our livelihood. He sees it all. He is a grown man now, most able to care for the house. And the beggar, Odysseus in disguise, advises her, quotes, not to put off the contest of the bow any longer. So, because Telemachus is coming of age, the situation is ripe for resolution. And in fighting against the suitors, he does well. He's a worthy son of his heroic father. The third background issue is the context of gift-giving and hospitality. Normally in peacetime, during the Homeric age, how did a person build up a reputation for himself? In three ways, I suggest. One, by upholding the proper laws of Zeus in relation to hospitality. Two, by calling on people, being honored by guests, as a guest with gifts, and establishing long-term alliances, also sealed with gifts. And three, through raiding expeditions and plunder. I'm not going to go into any of these, except to ask you to be aware when reading of the special idea of a guest gift, whether it is a bad guest gift, like the two ones the Cyclops gave to the person who identified himself as nobody, or good guest gifts, sealed friendships or treaties between different kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean in Homeric times. The fourth background issue is the question of order. A hero has to uphold not only the cosmic order, but more importantly in the Odyssey, which concerns peace, not war, the social and moral order. It's this social and moral order that's been disturbed by the unruly, violent presence of the suitors in Odysseus' palace while he's been away. And that Odysseus, on his homecoming, as revealer of the truth, reality as it should be, will restore. Apart from the abuse of Zeus's law of hospitality, the suitors do not honor the gods properly by sacrificing meat or pouring a libation of wine whenever they feast. And they, quotes, give way to the force and violence in themselves. It's when a person gives way to the force and violence in themselves that actions may become reckless, which in turn calls for punishment. In other words, there are three levels of order reflecting each other: cosmic order, social order, and personal order. The ideal of personal order is a well-balanced mind and moderation. For instance, being neither excessive in friendship nor excessive in hate, as Menelaus tells Telemachus. In all things, balance is better. You'll be meeting the idea of moderation as a mean between two extremes later in CS 201, when you read the ethics. Secondly, as far as social order is concerned, the head of a household maintains its order. Good leadership, in turn, leads to good government and to the people's prosperity. In the leader's absence, however, the order is liable to go to pieces. Penelope laments to Odysseus in disguise that there is none left to give orders in the household. And Eumaeus, the swineherd, says to Odysseus in disguise, serving men when their masters are no longer around to make them work and no longer willing to do their rightful duties. These are some of the more general background issues, but there are two other points that I want to raise before going through bits of the second half in greater detail. The idea of putting people to trial has already been mentioned. Odysseus has to test in person the behavior of his suitors, the loyalty of his servants, his wife, even his father. As Athene says to him in Book 13, when she has come to give him advice about how to proceed, anyone else come home from wandering would have run happily off to see his children and wife in his halls. But it is not your pleasure to investigate and ask questions, not till you have made a trial of your wife. And she praises him for this quality, which demonstrates his Metis, something which she, as the daughter of the goddess Metis, herself is. But in addition to the idea of putting other people always to trial, not taking appearances for granted, the figure of a general contest, when people are tested competitively against each other, should also be mentioned. The contest of the bow marks the climax of the story, when only Odysseus is able to string the bow, and when he shoots an arrow through a line of axe heads. how the beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, has been allowed to enter the contest after several suitors have failed, and the leader suggests postponing the contest until the following day, you must read for yourselves. Both Penelope, unknowingly, and Telemachus, knowingly, have a part in this. You can imagine what some of the suitors might have felt about a beggar being allowed a chance to compete, even if he is now Telemachus' guest and has been washed and clothed on Penelope's orders. One of them says, "We are ashamed to face the talk of the men and women, for fear some other might say, they are not able to string the bow." Then another, some beggar man, came wandering in from somewhere and easily strung the bow. That would be a disgrace for us all. Yes, indeed, more than a disgrace, it's going to be their destruction. Here the play on wandering and being a nobody is particularly marked. And what does Odysseus say when he's shot the arrow through the axe heads? Here is a task that has been achieved without deception. Reality in the raw, the beginning at the end, when order is restored and truth revealed. The idea of a contest, not only in athletics, but also in drama and poetry, was very important to the ancient Greeks. That's how the drama originated. The second general point is simply the skill of the poet, weaving his story into our hearts. When you read the second half, do please be aware of the dramatic effects Homer uses to draw the reader into the story and become emotionally involved. You have to imagine the Odyssey being recited out loud, live. The audience knows the story. It's up to the poet to keep the audience's interest, building up the climax, playing on words, playing on situations. This is where irony comes in, especially the irony of disguise. The audience knows that the wandering beggar is Odysseus in disguise, but the people to whom the beggar is talking do not. This ironical situation is played on by Homer to the full. What happens when his faithful dog recognizes Odysseus behind his disguise? Will his old nurse recognize his scar when she gives him a bath? Above all, when Odysseus in disguise is sitting right in front of his wife, many of their remarks to each other have particular pathos and irony. This is now what I want to try and bring out in relation to the underlying theme of truth, appearance, and reality. The various ways in which the proper order of reality may be disguised and people wander from the truth. The wandering beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, has already claimed to the swineherd Eumaeus that he has knowledge of the real Odysseus, whose imminent return he's prophesied. This is reported to Penelope, who naturally wants to question the man himself. Penelope summons Odysseus in disguise for an interview while the suitors are still feasting. But Odysseus tells Eumaeus, who has brought the summons, that it would be better to wait until the suitors have gone home for the night, because they're so unruly. As both Eumaeus and Penelope observe ironically, this is a funny beggar who refuses the opportunity of a good supper and clothes. A bashful vagabond, they say, makes a bad beggar. But Penelope agrees, and after the suitors have gone, this is now the beginning of book 19, she descends into the hall, where there are still a few serving maids clearing up, one of whom is especially insulting to the vagabond beggar. Odysseus in disguise spins a tale to Penelope about how he had entertained the real Odysseus in Crete 19 years ago, soon after the latter had left on the expedition against Troy. By claiming to be the brother of someone with whom Odysseus had a hereditary friendship, one of those special alliances I mentioned, sealed by a guest gift, and to have entertained Odysseus in his brother's absence, Odysseus in disguise is laying claim to Penelope's protection. He knew how to say many false things that were like true sayings, Homer comments. And then, quotes, as she listened, her tears ran, and her body was melted, as the snow melts along the high places of the mountains, and as it melts, the rivers run full flood. It was even so that her beautiful cheeks were streaming tears, as Penelope wept for her man, who was sitting there by her side. This is Homer, the poet, both drawing the audience into the emotion of the situation and pointing out its irony. Odysseus' eyes, Homer says, stayed steady under his lids. He hid his tears and deceived her. Now comes Penelope's first test. If you knew him when he left here 19 years ago, she says, I will give you a test. What was he wearing? Odysseus in disguise says, well, it's a long time ago, but... And he proceeds to describe minutely the special clasp that he'd worn at the time. This earns him Penelope's respect. Some things, he says, are true. And she says, stranger, while before this you had my pity, you now shall be my friend and be respected here in the palace. Odysseus in disguise presses on and says, I say to you, without deception, without concealment, that I have heard of the present homecoming of Odysseus. Oh, if only this were true, Penelope says, you would be sent on your way with full honor. But alas, quotes, there are none to give orders left in the household such as Odysseus was among men, if he ever existed. If he ever existed? Is this irony? Since, to the audience, Odysseus is right in front of Penelope. Is she unconsciously inviting him to throw off his disguise? Does she suspect something? Or is her mind wandering? She decides he needs a bath if he is to appear as a guest at the feast the following day. He says that only some aged and virtuous woman should do it. So Penelope appoints his old nurse, Eurycleia, to the task. There's then a marvelous scene when she looks at the old man in front of her and says how like Odysseus in build he is, and how the real Odysseus must even now be suffering in much the same way as the old beggar in front of her. She recognizes an old scar on his leg, and Odysseus had to clamp his hand over her mouth, not to give the game away. Of course, it isn't a game. Odysseus is testing his wife, and the timing of any disclosure he makes is crucial to his success against the suitors. Anyway, after his bath, Penelope again sits with the disguised Odysseus. Friend, she says, I will stay here and talk to you just for a little. To be sure, it will soon be the time for sweet rest. For one delicious sleep takes hold of, although he may be sorrowful. Again, the play on sinking back from reality. She asks him to interpret a dream she's had. This is now in the intimacy of the night. In the dream, she says, an eagle swooped down and killed all the geese she kept in the courtyard. But the eagle then perched on a roof and in a human voice said, do not fear, this is no dream, but a blessing real as day. You will see it done. The geese are the suitors, and I, the eagle, am your own husband. Come home, and I shall inflict shameless destruction on all the suitors. This is Penelope recounting a dream, foretelling Odysseus' return, to Odysseus in disguise, who is sitting right in front of her. What does he say in reply? "Lady," he says, "it is impossible to read this dream and avoid it by turning another way, since Odysseus himself has told you its meaning, how it will end. The suitor's doom is imminent." So now there's a triple conjunction. Odysseus in the dream as an eagle, foretelling to Penelope the imminent return of the real Odysseus and the suitor's destruction. The real Odysseus in disguise as a wanderer, telling her the same thing. And Odysseus in disguise interpreting the meaning of the dreamt Odysseus' prophecy. Is this Homer sending us all up? Or does it signify the intangibility of truth, the ease with which the proper order of reality can be veiled, and from which one can wander? Penelope will have none of it. These are, after all, words, not deeds. She says, dreams come out of one of two gates. Deceptive dreams that never come true come out of the gate of ivory. While those that do come true come out of the gate of horn. And she's afraid that this dream came out of the ivory gate, i.e. is deceptive. Anyway, with only disguised reality and dreamt truth, what can she do? The real Odysseus had not yet actually revealed himself nor killed the suitors. So Odysseus in disguise goes to sleep in the hall, and she sleeps in her chamber. He lies awake, bothered about how the following day will turn out, and how he's going to avoid the suitors' families taking vengeance on him. But Athene comes to reassure him and sends him to sleep. At the moment he falls asleep, Penelope wakes up in her own room. She cries a little and then prays to the goddess Artemis, prays that she die so that she can meet Odysseus in death, rather than have to marry one of the infernal suitors. But then she checks herself and says, any evil is endurable, for there's always sleep. Sleep is the oblivion of all things, both good and evil, she says. And with sleep come dreams. This very night, she says to herself while praying, there was one who lay beside me, as he was when he went with the army, i.e. like Odysseus, so that my own heart was happy. I thought it was no dream, but a waking vision. You get the idea. When the story is reaching its climax with the bow contest, when the suitor's wrongdoing will finally be punished, order restored, and Odysseus will throw off his disguise and reveal himself no longer as a wandering nobody, but as a hero who has succeeded by using his cunning intelligence rather than simple physical force, there is a long play on Penelope's bewilderment as a metaphor for the bewilderment of mortals in distinguishing a true path from a false one. Dreams, waking visions, sleep, death. Is he really and truly dead, even though I've waited for him for 20 years? Will I really have to marry a suitor after all the deception I successfully practiced, putting them off? Truth revealed when it finally arrives is hard to recognize. After the suitors have been killed, Odysseus reveals himself to Penelope as he really is. But she still can't accept reality until she finally tests him with a trick about the marriage bed. And in this test, Homer himself has a last trick up his sleeve. Penelope has to test whether the person in front of her, now no longer a beggar in rags, but properly bathed and spruced up by Athene, is really her husband. Come, she says to her maidservant, make up our bed in the chamber outside. What? Exclaims Odysseus, in real, not pretended anger. Who has moved the bed that I built on the trunk of an olive tree? Something that can't be moved. In this test, Penelope outsmarts the master of cunning, Odysseus. And Homer, in turn, outsmarts us listeners or readers, for unexpectedly we see that Penelope is more than a match for Odysseus in Metis. Husband and wife are thus truly alike in mind, as Odysseus had said is the ideal to Nausicaa, the daughter of the Phaeacian king, when he had first landed on the Phaeacians' island. Weaving a design with the wandering beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, telling so many stories about the real Odysseus, none of which are likely to be believed. What is Homer saying about his own art, the creation of fame, legend, immortality, truth? Thank you for your attention.